All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the March After Hours. My name is Candace Vinson, and I am the Outreach and Events Coordinator here at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. I'd like to welcome everyone tonight in person and online. We love that we can still do these hybrid now. So let's get into our talk this evening. Our lecture tonight will be given by VIMS alum, Dr. Michael Caron. He received a BS in oceanography from the U.S. Naval Academy, an MS and a PhD from here at VIMS, and an MA in National Security and Strategic Studies from the Naval War College. After leaving VIMS, Mike began his career at the U.S. Naval Oceanographic Office. In 1982, he became a science advisor to the Mediterranean Sixth Fleet. In the late 1980s, he was head of Navooceano's Physical Oceanography Branch. In 1996, he was appointed chief scientist, retiring in 2022 to become senior scientist for underwater acoustics at the NATO Center for Maritime Research and Experimentation in La Spezia, Italy. That's quite a retirement. La Spezia, Italy. The focus of his research for NATO was to understand the effects of man-made noises, especially military sonars, on marine mammals. From 2007 to 2011, Mike was the director of the Northern Gulf Institute, a NOAA cooperative institute. Following the Deepwater Horizon blowout in 2010, Mike became the director of the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, directing the spending of BP research funds granted to the nonprofit Gulf of Mexico Alliance. The 10-year research program ended in 2020, and he stays on working part-time and managing remaining programs such as databases, synthesis, and legacy activities. Mike and his wife, Susan, live in the city of Williamsburg near William and Mary, so right across the river. And a fun fact Dr. Caron is willing to share with you all tonight is that he would rather be traveling or skiing than working, something I think we can all kind of relate to. And without further ado, Dr. Caron.
Thank you. Good evening. It's great to be back in person, and it's great to be back at VIMS, although I only live over in Williamsburg. I get to come over here quite often anyway, but I love it. And today I'm going to talk about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill that happened about 12 years ago now. So most of us here were old enough to remember it. I'm sure a lot of the students at VIMS now at William & Mary were not old enough to remember it. They probably were in junior high school or high school when it happened. It just seems like it was a few years ago. But so today I'm going to talk about what happened a little bit and what the response was for research. There was a lot of things that happened. There was a particular thing that happened that ended up being called the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, and that's what I'll focus on today. Okay, so on April 20th, 2020, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig that was paid for by BP had an explosion, and there's been a movie made about it, and I'm not here to talk about what happened, except the fact that it exploded. 11 people were killed. The rig sank, a major disaster. The blowout preventer, the device that sits on the bottom that keeps the oil from coming out of oil wells when a crisis happens, failed. There were a lot of things that failed, but it broke. And for about 87 days, hot oil and gases and hot water blew out of that pipe. And it was a huge ecological disaster, and they could not get it stopped. And while this was going on, BP said, we will give $500 million for independent research on oil spills, on marine oil spills. And so a lot of things started moving around. I was asked to be a part of the team that made the agreement between the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, which is a consortium of the 5 Gulf states with the governors as the board of trustees that coordinate research to sort of manage the money and that stuff. Parallel to that, an independent board was created. The head of the board is Dr. Rita Caldwell, who was the head of the National Science Foundation, and her assistant and the vice chairman of that board is Margaret Linen, who's now the head of Scripps Institute of Oceanography in La Jolla. And so we have 20 members of that board. And I'll show you just a little organizational chart. I'm going to try not to show you a lot of graphs with lots of words and stuff on it because I don't like reading those things. They're hard to read on the screen. But I have a couple that I have to show you because it kind of lays things out. But so this organization got going. We had about over 3,000 scientists and graduate students funded for the last 10 years. We produced 1,700 plus referee journal articles, and we produced multi-terabytes of data that are all going to be made public. They're all public now, as a matter of fact. And the rule was that when we did this, that all the research had to be made public and all the data had to be made public. So that's kind of where I am. And I'm gonna approach this whole thing kind of as a student more than a scientist, because I'd like to get it down. There was so much information was created. And I'm just going to show you some little pieces of it to kind of give you a feeling for it. And then I'll give you some links to some documentaries we've done that are Matt Damon narrated. They're a lot more fun than listening to me. But so when you have an incident like this, with major spill, I mean, this is like unprecedented. I mean, this had some other things during the Iraqi war and stuff, but this was terrifying. And the people that lived in the Gulf of Mexico, like the people in the Chesapeake Bay would be, if there was a major oil spill here, if there was drilling going on. And so there are a bunch of questions that you would ask. And so that's kind of the way we kind of see this problem. And I'm going to go through these questions, and just a few of them. For example, where's all the oil and where's it going? You have it turns out to be close to 5 million barrels of oil times 42. That's how many gallons is in a barrel. So it's a lot of oil. Where's it going? In a minute, I'll show you a picture of an airplane spraying dispersants. Dispersants are put on oil spills to break up the oil patches into small pieces so that hopefully bacteria can process this oil, and it increases the surface area and things happen to the oil to get rid of it. So the question is, are dispersants and other mitigation activities safe to use? And what impact do they have on the environment? A picture of that. That's a plane spraying the dispersant over the top of the oil in the Gulf. Something really dear to all of our hearts here living in this area, being at VIMS and living in Gloucester, and in this area is the seafood safe to eat? That's a vital question. Is it safe to, let me, if I can get this to go. That's that one. Is it safe to swim on the beaches? I mean, people were going back to the beaches in the Gulf of Mexico, as you can see from this photograph, where the cleanup workers were on the beach trying to find the oil and get rid of it and the toxic material. Look how they're dressed, and look how the swimmers are dressed. They're laying there in their bikinis, and these people are in sort of hazardous suits, which probably weren't enough. They should have been wearing, masks. So some other questions are, how, is it safe to swim too in the water? I mean, these are big questions that impacted the economy and everything. How fast will the oil go away, and where will it go? I'll address that a little bit. What marine resources will be affected, and for how long? It's a big question because the Gulf of Mexico shut down fisheries for a year. Can you imagine if they came in here and said, no more fishing boats go out fishing for a whole year? No more oyster harvesting, no more, floundering, no, all of the stuff that happens, it's so important for this area. That happened in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, part of 2011. What marine resources will be affected and for how long? How long will coastal communities be affected in the short and long term? And are we better prepared for the next oil spill? Because it'll happen again. I mean, it will happen again. We will have another one. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So this is the first of 3 messy view graphs, and I'll just talk about it a little bit. So this is the way we laid out the organization. There was a thing called the Master Research Agreement, and this was the contract between BP and the Gulf of Mexico Alliance. We're going to give you $500 million, and this is what you must do. This is what we can do. Those kind of rules. I mean, it was a contract. We spent a lot of time worrying about this because of intellectual property issues and stuff like that. But the bottom line was that BP had promised that this would be independent research. And so the agreement, and they did agree to do this, is they would have no input at all into the research, into the decisions, who we funded, the decisions about what was published. They did not get pre-approval on publications. They were out of the business. They just had to give us the money. And I had to send them a bill every quarter for about $12 million a quarter. I mean, and they were paying, they wrote the check. They were very good about that. And they did not challenge us. So on the right side, that was me. That was my team there, the management team. And we were responsible for running the request for proposals, doing all of that kind of like business stuff, and writing the contracts with the university researchers. And one of the rules that had come, the research board, the left part, that independent research board, headed by Dr. Caldwell, was that we don't want to fund individual researchers. We think it's really important that we have universities who compete against each other to work together. And so I would say 90% of our funding went to consortia of 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 universities in 17 different countries. A lot of the money went to Gulf states, but a lot of them came in. I'll show you a map of where the universities were. And VIMS was part of that. And VIM was a member of multiple consortia. VIMS scientists were. And what that made people do that normally competed with each other now work together, became friends. And now that the program is generally over, they're still working together in places, going after grants together and bringing world experts that normally would compete for the same dollar, get a third of each of those dollars or whatever. And it works a lot better. And so the people at the bottom of our organization is the top. That's the research board and the management team, which is relatively small. Now it's very small. And then all the researchers down at the bottom that got around $400 million or so. And we had rules on database management and stuff like that. One other thing, we required all researchers to put all of their data into a database managed by Texas A&M University at Corpus Christi, Hart Research Institute. And it had to be made public, and it has been made public. And we helped them. We had a team of people there that went and helped the university researchers put their data into the database in a way that everybody could get to it, which is not the way it normally works. If you get money from National Science Foundation, they'll say you have to make your data public. They don't tell you how to do that. They don't make you do it. It's a different way of seeing the world, and we made them do it. And I think we had 95% compliance. There's always somebody. We'll move on here. So this is the second of 3 messy diagrams. This one's really important. I want you to look at this really closely. This is kind of the way we see the world from the scientific perspective. You know, what if you have an oil spill, which is that upper left-hand part, which is oil release, things start happening. You know, oil moves from one place to the other. Can you predict that? That starts moving into the ocean environment. There's toxicity things. You can read some of those hydrodynamics, air transport, air exposure. You know, there were all kind of things start happening. And each one of those little arrows, if you were trying to model this, you would have to put an equation there or a computer program to build the information that passes from one part of the arrow to the other. And we all do this in our lives without thinking about it. When you eat a fish from, say you buy shrimp and it comes from China, just think of all the stuff. Is it pollute? Is it safe? Is it what? You know, how does it get here? How much fuel is used to get here? Does it go on a truck? Is it frozen? I mean, you could draw diagrams like this about our lives. We normally don't. But scientists kind of look at that, particularly multidisciplinary scientists that say, and particularly our program, this is kind of a picture of that program. This is really complicated. And we say, you know, this is hard. When we put out a request for proposal, we can't throw something like this at them and say, hey, we'll pay you money to do this. We have to kind of make it simpler. And so that's what we did. We said, well, we can look at this. We have human health. We have the environment. We have biological systems. Let's simplify it. And then in the proposal, we'll let people propose different parts of this. I like this diagram myself. We call it a spaghetti diagram. It just shows you how complex the world is, and it's how complex it is if there's an oil spill. And so we decided we would have 5 themes. And the first theme is the physical distribution of the oil. So the oil comes out of the thing that comes out of the crude oil that comes out of that pipe that's bubbling into the ocean is made up of really three things. It's made up of crude oil, which are big hydrocarbon chains, probably 1 million different compounds, methane gas, other kind of gases, and hot water. And it's under a tremendous amount of pressure, and it's coming out very deep in the ocean where it's really cold and under a lot of pressure, and it's an explosion. And at that point, that's where we got interested. We're not interested in anything before that. Okay. The Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative focuses from that point on, not what happened with the well blowing out or any of that stuff. What happens to that oil once it enters from under the ground? And so one way you can look at what happens to the oil is to look at it really closely to where it's coming out. So when it blows out of the pipe, this was done in a laboratory. Could we do that in the laboratory and start understanding what these little pieces of oil that are in gases are exploding out, what happens to them? So this is a sample of one of the research projects. And that's a little video we made of that. So the next level is there a way to model this on a computer? Because we can't go out and put oil in the ocean. We had proposals that would say, hey, we want to put 10 liters, 10 Coke bottles full of oil in the ocean and see what happens to it as part of our experiment. And the answer was, no, you can't. You cannot get a permit to do that. Okay. So what do you do as scientists? You say, okay, what do we know? What can we do in the lab? And then can we build computer models to actually help us predict things? And so this photograph on the left is from Skowalski and Adams in 2003. They were injecting gases into water and seeing what happened to the gas as it rose up in the water that was stratified. So it wanted to float up to the top. And they were measuring that with cameras. Didn't have supercomputers back then. They had some, but they were hard to come by. But now we have supercomputers. So we have physicists that think about this as a computer problem with a math problem and a physics problem. And this is an example from University of Miami, where they're actually trying to model this thing in the computer. And you can see all the little dots you see are little pieces that the physics have to be known about. And you can see it's similar to what we see there. So this is modeling what happens to the oil when it comes out of the bottom. And that's getting closer to being able to run nature on a computer, which is really hard to do. But that's what we have to do to be able to predict the future, because we can only do that with a computer. We can't do that from nature. We can't predict the future. We can guess at it, but the models know the physics better, and the better we know the physics, the better the models are. Another example of that is a similar one, but in the ocean, there's currents. So the question here is, what happens to that oil and gas and water mixture if it comes out and there's a current? So you want to know, where is it going and what's happening? And this one's really kind of interesting because it illustrates a couple of things. So in the model, they had different stuff represented by different colors, different densities of oil or gases or whatever. And depending on the nature of that stuff that was coming out and the current going across from left to right, different things would happen. Some stuff comes right up to the surface, and you'll see pictures of that in a minute. Some of the stuff kind of disappears, it gets in that blue thing. And those of you who are really paying attention to the Deepwater Horizon, they keep talking about the oil plume. You know, in all of our minds, we kind of think of this plume as being a big bubble of 10WD-40 or 10W30 or something floating in the ocean. And that's not really the way it was. The stuff went into the water, and the gases and some of the light oils, and they go into solution. So if you took a sample of that and looked at it, you might not see it. But if you looked at it microscopically, the stuff is in solution. And you wouldn't have a cup full of oil. The cup full of oil stuff went up, and that yellow line went to the surface. That was pretty much thick stuff, but it actually cracked. When they do a refinery, they crack oil, they pull the hydrocarbon chains out and change them, and all that kind of happens in the ocean. And that's the physics. So that was the first theme. Then there was in that first theme too, Admiral Allen, one of us went asking him a question. He was the on-scene commander for the Coast Guard for the oil spill. And we said, what are you really interested in? And he said, I'm only interested in what I can do something about. So you guys are studying what's happening in the water column. I can't do anything about it. There's no way for me to get in there, to get the oil. There's no technology to get it out or even get in there. It's hard enough to do it on the surface. Said, I need to know where it's going on the surface, and then I can do something about that. So one of the first experiments was each of those little red dots were 3 buoys that were put in the ocean with GPS receivers, and they let them drift around to see where they would go in the ocean and compare that with the models that were running in different oceanographic centers where they do modeling, and to see where did the things go. And you'll notice the easy one to see is the one on the left here. Yeah, one, like a black one going off to the left and a green and a red one kind of curling up. They were put in the same spot. They would turn loose. And they didn't go, you would think, well, they'll just drift together, right? They separate and they go different places. Hurricane Iris went through while this experiment was going on, which was not good because it kind of screwed up the experiment, but it also helped to say, what happens when a hurricane goes through? Nobody had ever had this. You couldn't plan this. You couldn't do it and put out lots of these drifters and have a hurricane go through it. I mean, you just be scrambling around. Everybody's getting out of there when a hurricane's coming. So that happened. And that was 300 buoys that were put out, and they tracked each one of them, and they could tell how far they went apart from each other. And it helped them build better models and helped all the modelers because all of this data was made public. So that was the first theme. The second theme, and I don't have any other view graphs except this one to show this one, is chemical evolution and biological degradation. So the oil comes out and it physically does something. It floats around, it changes, but the chemistry also changes when the pressures change in things, or if it goes to the surface and the sun shines on it. There's all of these changes that take place. The hydrocarbon change. 2 other things happen to an oil spill: biological degradation. There's especially in the Gulf of Mexico, where there's lots of little seeps of oil. There's bacteria and little animals, microscopic animals that actually can eat oil. If there's energy, something's generally going to live there and try to get that energy. And so the second theme was, can we understand the changes in the oil based on biology and chemistry? We had a lot of people working on that. The other part was environmental effects. This is what bottlenose dolphins look like in the Gulf of Mexico normally. This is what the same type of dolphins look like in the middle of an oil spill. So you know, these guys are sucking in air on the top of their head. I could do that if I had a hole up here too. I got the same head as some of those guys. But you know, so you've got this oil on the surface. They don't know how to avoid this stuff. They don't really understand what's going on. And they're swimming and they're breathing in and out through this oil on top of their head. And so we had a big research program in Barataria Bay, which is on the western side of the Mississippi River. They got really heavily oiled and had a big population of these guys. So this is just an example of what is the environmental effect on, like, mammals, fish. This little graph up at the top shows 2011, 2012, 2013. This is the percentage of fish that were sampled, like red snapper, that had lesions on their bodies. And this is a photograph over here on the right as a zoom in on that lesion. And so would you want to eat this fish? I don't know. You know, so this was a real big deal, that the fish seemed to be having lesions after the oil spill. And then a few years after the oil spill, the lesions stopped being seen. So that's kind of like going from the mammal to the fish. You can go to you know, either further down into to microscopic levels and see, you know, impacts and how that ripples through the food chain, things like that. So let's move on. And then so the fourth theme was technology developments. We knew that people would be inventing stuff to help answer these questions. And so that was the theme for us. And so I'm going to just show you a couple of examples. There were lots of them, and I'm going to show you how you can find out about all of this stuff. Okay. We made it real easy in some cases and harder in others. But so this photograph here is one of those drifting buoys, not the one that I showed you, but the second group. We had another group of 1,000 they put out. The first group that they noticed, they seemed to move faster than the currents, and they were fixed. the buoy was like a solid piece. So they experimented for a couple of years on, can we develop a buoy that that the waves don't make it walk, just being in the waves. They only wanted the current to move it, not the wind and not the waves. So if you put something solid in, the waves are bouncing, they now have unmanned vehicles they put out and the waves drive it along. So it was the buoys were doing that. So they spent a lot of time experimenting with this to build one that the stuff underneath could move with the waves, but the top didn't, and it didn't walk along. And they put 1,000 of these out in little triangles, and then track them and see how did they separate, how did the triangles separate from each other, and what happened in each triangle. And that was another experiment. Another great thing happened. Johns Hopkins University is when this whole program started, and we started funding them and the consortia they work with the University of Texas. And Johns Hopkins built a laboratory just for Joe Katz, who's a researcher there, to look at what happens to the oil on the surface if they're breaking waves, and if we put dispersant on that oil and they're breaking waves, how can you study what's happening? And so I'll show you some little videos later on that. But that's a photograph of up there on the left of a flume that makes waves, and then they have a holographic camera that takes three-dimensional photos of the oil in the breaking waves, and you can see the little particulate oil going up in the air, and some that sink. It turns out the ones that go up in the air, if they're smaller than a micron, don't come down. And then the wind can blow it over the people on shore or the workers, and they can breathe this stuff in. So lots of things were discovered in our laboratory. This is my favorite technology development. This is a fish treadmill. So any of us those of us, and a few of us in the room have had stress tests where you get on the bike or whatever, the treadmill, and they wire you up and they do that. Well, University of Miami, in their consortia, the Recover Consortia, they grew my from larvae, and they exposed some of the larvae to oil. They exposed some of them to oil and dispersant. And they had a control group they didn't expose. And when they grew them up, they grow real fast. They put them on this treadmill. They can run, they can make them go swim as fast as they want them to. And then they can do ultrasounds of their heart while they're alive. So you don't have to kill the fish. They did do that too, some. They would take the hearts out and then put little electrodes on it, make the hearts beat. But that was one of the programs they actually had the treadmill. And it's fun to watch. And I don't know if that'll show up in any of the videos that I'll show tonight, but I don't think so. Let's go. Okay, the fifth theme was human health. And this is a really important one. This is probably the hardest one. And this is the last of the really busy view graphs. You could take this view graph and take all the little words on the right and the left and change them. But when there's a major event that impacts humans, these are the things that can happen. You can have psychological effects, physical health effects, economic effects, sociological effects, and cultural effects. And in Louisiana, they had all of these. You had areas in Louisiana that lost their livelihoods and never came back. And you had people in Louisiana that they subsisted on, they ate the food that they and their neighbors caught. They may have sold some of it, but they depended on that for their livelihood. And they were, for a year, they couldn't harvest. I mean, and some of them never really recovered. And you remember with the Exxon Valdez, that happened a long time ago. There's still some fish populations up in Alaska that have not recovered. So that impacts those Native American fishermen that were up there and stuff like that. So we also funded research, Rand Corporation, some other people, to look at what were the health impacts and the psychological impacts on the people that were in the area that had the spill. Okay, so that's that. So we're going to get with it. Okay, this is a plot of all of the universities in the United States that were funded. The dots don't mean anything about how much they got. They got $1, they got a dot. If they got $1 million, they got a dot. But that kind of shows you that we had universities working together, oftentimes in groups of 10 or 12 that were funded by us. And there were 17 different countries, 16 foreign countries in the United States. Most of the money came to the United States, but there were some real specialists in the Scandinavian countries because of the North Sea oil that really knew how to do this stuff. And they had great labs. Uh, we had produced 3 documentaries, and they were about 55 minutes long over the period of the research. Matt Damon volunteered to actually narrate them for us, and he did for free, which was nice. His voice is better than mine, or other, but they're really nice, and they're all downloadable on YouTube. You can get them on YouTube now, and they're the link for those will be given to you at the end of this. These are just photographs of the dispersants being spread. This is just a quick little video of where the oil went during, that was measured by satellites and stuff over that 87-day period. You'll see that it pretty much ultimately moved up into Mississippi, Alabama, along the Barrier Islands, and quite a bit of it had already gone into Barataria Bay, which is that body of water just west of the mouth of the Mississippi River. This is because VIMS in the Gulf of Mexico is, Virginia have a lot in common, a lot of beaches, a lot of marshes, a lot of ecosystems. I just wanted to show you a couple of these things. The red and the orange are heavily oiled areas. There was about 1,300 miles of shoreline that got oil on it. The people walked those things. They teams, thousands of people with shovels trying to recover as much as they couldn't get it into burned or whatever they did with it when they picked it up. By the states, Louisiana has a lot more coastline than Mississippi or Alabama. Most of the oil went into Louisiana, and Mississippi and Alabama, the shorelines are so short that they get a little smaller percentage, but it wasn't insignificant. These are the wetlands, particularly in Louisiana, that were impacted. All the red and the orange in there. That real blob of red, that's Barataria Bay. It's where a lot of dolphins live in there. A lot of oil got caught up in that bay and stayed in there for a long time. There's a lot of marshes along the Mississippi and Alabama coastline, but a lot of it's protected by the Barrier Islands. Some of it got through there, but the area down in Louisiana, the marshes come up pretty much right to the Gulf. So 52% of the oil that hit land hit marshes, which wetlands. That kind of shows you what a healthy marsh looks like. You can see the bridge in the background. This isn't similar, but where the oil hit, that's what it looked like. So that's what that's what we were facing, trying to understand what's going to happen to this marsh and what is the future of those marshes. The deep ocean and the Gulf, the left is deep sea corals. Deep sea corals grow sometimes maybe an inch or two in 100 years. So if you damage a deep sea coral, that's why the government's really serious about you not going down and grabbing them with hooks or anything. It takes centuries for them to grow back just a foot or two. The one on the right was within 10 miles of the blowout site. That's what it looked like for the most part. It's dead. And there's a brittle straws kind of hanging on it there. The beaches are really important in Mississippi and Alabama, the Barrier Islands and the Mississippi Gulf Coast beaches. To the west of Barataria Bay, you have Grand Isle, and those beaches are really important too. And if you notice where the beaches are, they got oil. It was really easy for that oil to get up on those beaches. And we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to skip this one, but it basically shows you what happens around a beach when the oil gets there. Some of it goes on in the bottom, the water, storms come in, it picks it up and throws it up on the beach. A lot of the asphalt type stuff forms little balls of sand. And I remember when we lived in Texas, we'd walk in on the beaches in Texas, and Susan, who's sitting in the back, would complain because her bathing suit would get little spots of oil on them because those just from the oil rigs out there. And this was a lot worse. This is what the beaches look like. And this stuff would have been shoveled up by hand. Thousands of people were hired to do that. I think it cost tens of billions of dollars. This is Pensacola Beach like a year later. So if you dig down in the trench, you'd still see a layer of oil in there. But by this time, people are back on the beaches playing. The kids are digging in the sand and stuff. Now, over time, bacteria and stuff in the sand will degrade this stuff, and it's pretty much gone now. So there were some lessons learned, and this is important to VIMS, for the VIMS people, because, if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, there's going to be a lot of pressure over the next 10 years or so for us to start drilling off the east coast of the United States in these deep water rigs. And if you do that, there's some things that VIMS and state legislatures and people like that can do if they put pressure on the federal government, because it's all in federal waters, the deep stuff. What's important. And, it's one of the things that they learned when they were doing the beach cleanups, where at first they had people out there shoveling stuff dressed like, no, not like I am, but I had shorts on and a t-shirt. And they realized that they needed PPE and devices that can measure volatile organics, fumes coming up. People were sucking fumes in. It was 100 degrees, and they had to start wearing those yellow suits and masks and things like that. You have to think about that. And the public wants to be assured about the seafood safety. People were not sure about that. Even when seafood was being tested and they were not finding anything in it, people still weren't sure about that. Some of the response measures may be worse than the problem. We don't know. And that's what we were trying to figure out. Do injecting dispersants at depth when nobody had ever done that before, is that good or bad? And, so there's a lot of research, a lot of papers have been written saying it's good, some saying it's bad. So that's why science works. A really important thing to VIMS would be to make sure that if they start drilling for oil out there, that money comes to institutions like VIMS and ODU and places like that and get baseline studies, because you can't do an assessment of how much damage was done if you didn't know what you had to start with. If there was a car all burned up and you said, oh, I wonder how much damage was done to that car, you say, well, what kind of car was it? Was it a BMW or was it a Volkswagen Beetle? I don't know. It's one of those questions. And we didn't have that in the Gulf. The Gulf was underfunded for years by the federal government. And they were taking a lot of money from the oil industry, but they weren't putting any of it back into research. So it's really important that we understand what's out there. That's called baseline studies. And it's important to monitor the ecosystems after it's all over, every time there's one of these things. So, I think it's going to happen. I really believe that at some point, there'll be a particular government, they will allow drilling, and it'll happen. I don't know when it's going to happen. Does anybody have questions? If you have, raise your hands if you have questions. If not, I'll show you another little video. Would you rather watch a video? Okay, this is another teaser for one of our 3 documentaries. So it was the last one.
An international team of researchers are focused on the Gulf of Mexico.
There we go.
These are some of their stories, intimate portraits of research, innovation, discovery. I'm Matt Damon. Please join me on a journey marked by unexpected twists and turns.
Since 2012, the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative has funded the largest research collaboration in the history of marine science. It includes thousands of scientists from around the world, and it's a truly amazing story.
The collaboration between scientists around the world to look at this Deepwater Horizon spill is just unprecedented. It's never happened in the Gulf before. I don't know if it's happened anyplace else, but it has brought in worldwide expertise to the Gulf.
Scientists can answer a lot of questions, but we can't do that by ourselves. We have to do that with the help from each other. We don't always have those resources at our own universities. So this great big collaborative community that we are part of allows us to answer questions that we couldn't possibly answer if we were working on our own.
We need expertise in diverse areas, from marine biology to chemistry to genetics to environmental sciences to aerosol sciences to human health.
It certainly includes an awful lot of scientists from people that are understanding the deep water environments, the benthic communities on the deep water environments, what happens as oil flows through the water column, what happens to the oil on the surface, what happens when it comes ashore on sandy beaches, and what happens when it comes ashore on salt marshes in Louisiana.
When I started doing science 24 years ago or so, you had individual investigator projects. That was the norm. The Deepwater Horizon was certainly one of the best examples of collaborative science, and I think that what it sort of illustrates to the world and to the general public is that the sum is greater than the one.
It's daunting. It's honest to God, this is a lot like the Manhattan Project. I mean, it's a very, very large scale, both physically large scale. The amount of funding is unprecedented in terms of funding in response to an environmental disaster.
When I think about my involvement with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, I think the one thing that probably could be identified as a silver lining, at least for me personally, was the collaboration. The people that this disaster brought together to try to really understand the impact that the spill had on animals, and in my case, on marine mammals.
I'm a biological oceanographer by training. Oceanography in generally is very interdisciplinary and collaborative because in the ocean you can't understand any one thing. If you want to understand a biological process, you need a physicist to explain to you how the thing moves while you're trying to study it, and you need a chemist trying to show you the interaction.
And so it's an opportunity to learn about a lot of different fields from experts on different topics, and really be able to think comprehensively about how we handle large problems.
The collaborative nature of the GOMRI program is truly what makes it special. To be able to come to conferences once a year and be surrounded by people who are addressing exactly the same topic as you, who are as passionate as you about the same issues, is very, very important.
It's a bit like a family meeting, especially coming to the yearly conferences. So it's not only about work, but it's about building friendships across nations, across cultures.
This collaboration will stay in the future. We made really good friends and really great colleagues to work with. So, I mean, this is been really extraordinary.
You challenge each other, you force each other to think outside of your little box that you're used to being in and where your comfort zone is. And I find that incredibly stimulating because you're exposed to new ideas, you're exposed to new technologies, it broadens your thinking, it broadens your perspective, and it allows you to bring in tools and apply tools that you might not necessarily have thought to apply to the problem. It's the wave of the future.
Today, the scientific community is working together to push the boundaries of what they've learned about oil spills and what still needs to be discovered.
Well, that's it. But there's just a couple things I want to show you. We've had the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative webpage is going to be up and running for another 10 years. Those of you who would be interested, if you're scientific, all of the databases, all the data are available on our GOMRI database, which is that second link on this thing. The three documentaries which Matt Damon narrated are all available. I suggest you watch them. They're very, very good. I've watched them many times. We've had other people help us with our outreach activities. The Smithsonian has a Gulf Oil Ocean portal that we've sponsored, and it's excellent. And I have a link here if anybody's interested in what VIM's role has been. And I can, if we have a minute, depending on the questions. There are two other things. Sea Grant, the Gulf Sea Grant program, we hired to be our outreach to the citizenry, and they've produced many more than this, but like 6 to 8 page documents that answered questions or focused on different things like what happens if there's dispersant in the water, what happens to the fisheries, what's going on, what are the questions people are asking, and they've done that. All of these are available on that website that's on the bottom there. And Oceanography magazine has had 2 special editions, one in 2016 and one in last year, in May of last year. It focuses on the research. The first one was on ongoing research, and the one in May was pretty much on the synthesis of all of the research that has been done. And these are all available and they're free. Normally you have to have a subscription. We paid so that these 2 issues are available to anybody who wants to see them. So you can go in there and go to each chapter and read them and look at them. And, so that's it. I've invited somebody to join me if there are questions. Chuck Wilson is our chief scientist. He's on the Zoom call. He lives in Fairhope, Alabama. We don't have offices. We never have. So when COVID hit, we just kept running. And we kept working. But he's on, he was the head of the Louisiana Sea Grant. He was the head of the Oceanography department at LSU. He was in senior administration at Louisiana State University. He was on our research board for a while, and then we said he's too good for that. We'll put him on, we'll make him chief scientist. So he's on because he can answer questions that I can't answer. But mainly, he's important because he's an oyster grower. So he grows oysters for a living, and besides being chief scientist. And so he does 1 million or 2 oysters a year, and that's more important than all of this stuff for us, right? So if there are any questions, we have a few minutes.
Hopefully my question's easy to answer. You mentioned the need to, in anticipation of future oil spills, that we need to start baselining. Is that happening? I mean, are maritime areas baselining what's there, undertaking those efforts so that if there are future oil spills that we'll know what the impact is?
I'm going to answer a little bit and let Chuck answer, but I think in the Gulf of Mexico, there was a lot of data collected during this whole process. I don't believe there's a lot of funding for that now. Chuck, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like Mike said earlier, if we're going to begin to do exploratory drilling and then development off to the East Coast, we need to make sure that the government invests in collecting baseline data, because that's a requirement of the oil companies, and they have to return the water bottom in the area back to the state that it was in prior to the development before they even agree to take on that lease. And unfortunately, those data do not exist. And of course, the what used to be the Mineral Management Service and now the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is responsible for that as an arm of the federal government. And they need to be held to task on making sure they invest in collecting those data. But unfortunately, it is not done in a comprehensive way. It's scattered through a variety of different funding sources, and it's really not targeted at where the oil and gas mining will take place. But great question. And in my mind, like Mike's, the answer is no, we're not.
Hello. A comment, not a question, but back in the late 70s, VIMS was heavily involved in a BLM project off the coast of Virginia in anticipation of oil drilling off the coast of Virginia. It was biological chemical analysis of the sediments and the biota as a benchmark, essentially, in the event that there would be contamination resulting from future oil drilling. So that ought to be a starting point.
Yes.
Proposals that we'll be putting together going forward to try and do it again, because again, that was in the late 70s, so it's pretty dated at this point.
Yeah, I was funded through that program when I was a graduate student here, and there was a lot of money at that period for research and doing that. Just not basic research, but going out and find out what do we have, what how much of each species exists, stuff like that. You don't see that so much anymore. So, any other questions? Oh, over here.
Did your project include discovering or breeding bacteria that were particularly good at breaking down oil? And is there a way of deploying them? And,
I know the answer is yes, but I'll let Chuck. Chuck, you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. Another great question. The answer is yes. There are a number of bacteria present in the Gulf of Mexico that are there because of all the natural oil seeps that were identified as being critical in responding to the oil spill. And they have time series using genetic markers to track the evolution of those different species. And it goes from a pre-oil spill community, during the oil spill community, and afterwards. And there are a number of different species that were critical in that response, and they were very effective. Unfortunately, we have not developed, species that can be released at the time of an oil spill to help mitigate it. That's been proposed. It's a great concept. I think it's a real viable idea, but we have not done that. But the bacteria were critical responders, and it was almost immediate based on a lot of the genetic fingerprinting that we can do now.
Thanks, Chuck. Are there any questions from
Yeah, I think we have one.
Okay.
Oh, time for one more.
Yeah, so we've got some good questions online. Unfortunately, we only have time for one of these, but I will pose them to our speaker and maybe he can address them afterward. But John Harding says, great summary of the GOMRI effort. As the NGI technical director pre-GOMRI, you were key in getting early funding to researchers already in the Gulf during the first months before the formal competitive process got underway. And could you speak to that effort a little bit?
Yeah, what happened? Thanks, John. Yeah, I was chief scientist and director of the Northern Gulf Institute, and I left, and John became that. So we're whole friends. And he lives in Williamsburg, and we come over here for lectures together. He's not here today. But what happened was BP said, the oil was gushing out. There were ships out at sea. They had contracts to do other work with the government or whatever. And they were trying to respond to this, but that wasn't in their contract. And so we met with BP and said, we have got to get funding out now. This oil spill is happening. We need to measure outside of where the oil is and start doing baseline studies, understanding what's going on. So if the oil comes in there, we have at least some, before and after things. One of the problems of getting research ships in there where the oil spill was, it was really dangerous. And the government, Admiral Allen, people, they didn't want research ships running around because they had all these recovery vessels. There was oil on the surface and gas. They could have been explosions. They didn't know what was going to happen. And so they really limited what you could do inside the spill area, maybe 5 or 6 miles from that. And so we went to BP and we said, we need funding now. We can't wait for an RFP process. We were putting this board together. They were excellent. They were going to do a great job, but that takes time, and it takes time to do requests for proposals. And so they gave $45 million out. They wrote checks for $45 million. And the organization that John and I work for got 10. Louisiana State University got 10. National Institutes of Health got 10. A couple of other Louisiana, LSU got some money, and we spread the money out. We didn't take our money and just spend it on ourselves. We funded universities all over the Gulf to get people out there collecting data. Thanks, John. It was a good question. And BP was actually very responsive, believe it or not. And they also, just so you would know, they were required by legal process, that we were not part of that legal process, to end up giving $1 billion to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to be spent over 30 years, and $500 million to the National Academy of Science to be spent over 30 years. And that seems like a lot of money, but when you spend it over 30 years, $1 billion now isn't $1 billion 30 years from now. And so they're both doing their business with that money now. And some of our board members and Chuck are involved with some of the decisions they're making to do that. So thank you very much. I'll hang around for a while if anybody has a question.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Can we
you.
hear our speaker? Thank you for joining us in person, and thank you to those of us who joined online, and special thank you to Chuck for joining us virtually as well. That was awesome. And we will hopefully see you here at Marine Science Day, Saturday, June 4th. And your email should all have the links in them already. And for those of you watching in the future, they will be linked on our YouTube below. So be sure to check those out. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.